In this video, I'm going to share with you 3 reasons why answering the question, are you a Christian, is not as easy as you think. Let's get to it. Hi, I'm Lionel. Welcome back to the channel. You know, I've spent the past 24 years as a teacher, leader, and pastor. And I spend my time now helping officials in high-ranking authority understand the intersectionality between faith, spirituality, and culture. And in this dynamic has given me a quite unique perspective of how to handle or address this question. One of the ways to think about this question or this answer, how can you identify, are you a Christian, or is there such a thing as a true Christian, really has to take into account the multiple perspectives by which individuals approach Christianity. For instance, you will have Christians who read the same Bible, different translations, but essentially the same story, but have different perspectives about the story. Or you'll find maybe one group of Christians who are on the West Coast may have very different practices of Christianity from those in the South, or those on the East Coast, or those in the Midwest. And so what this is telling us is that although there's the same story we're talking about, there's very different interpretations. And what I'm going to give you is going to help you understand, why is it so divisive? Why do you have people who can say that they are Christians, act or live very differently from those in other groups who also say they are Christians, but their message doesn't seem to match up? And so one of the ways to understand that is that there's a particular framework by which each of these groups practicing their Christianity or living out their Christianity. And I like to call this a theological framework by which they're living out their Christianity. And I'm going to give you those 3 frameworks right now. The first framework I'm going to give you is a contextual framework. Okay, so if you ask me, for instance, hey, are you a Christian? My answer back to you is going to be somewhat like this. Are you asking me if I am a European Christian? Are you asking me if I ascribe to the Christian values of a post-antebellum period? Are you asking me if I'm an African-American Protestant Christian? Are you asking me if I'm an African-American middle-class Christian? The reason why I bring this up is because when we think about context, every person comes and reads the biblical text or listens to someone who interprets the biblical text from their context. And that's increasingly important in the field of theology. What we say is no one interprets scripture from a blank text or out of a vacuum, but we all bring our personal biases to the text when we read them. So if you ask someone, are you a Christian? You gotta really accept their answer based upon their context. What I'm simply giving you a demonstration of is that we see the biblical text based on our context, based on the people we're listening to, and then based on the environment we're in. Back in the 60s, for instance, there were Christians who went to church faithfully every Sunday. They considered themselves Bible-believing Christians, yet they believed that segregation was correct. I think it was Bob Jones University who held the idea that black and whites should not intermarry, and they carried that idea all throughout the 80s and into the 90s, and perhaps even beyond that. And so this is another example about how contextual theologies really lends itself toward how a person interprets the biblical text. In an African-American interpretation of the biblical text, protest can be not just something that is a social construct or a social collective activity, but a biblical imperative. In the African-American community, particularly those pre-1980, to interpret the gospel of Jesus Christ as a gospel that speaks truth to power. And they will use the story of Jesus against Pontius Pilate and against the Roman Empire as biblical authority by which they approach protesting in this light. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and those intimately involved in the civil rights movement held it as a gospel imperative, as a Bible imperative, as a Jesus imperative. Their protest was not only their right, but it was a Christian right, and it was a divine right. And if one did not participate in this, they were not participating in the work of God on the earth. Second framework is a liberationist framework. What a liberationist framework does is that it allows for individuals who have a different theological perspective, particularly those who are oppressed or from the margins, to speak and define what Christianity really is, what it means, and how it is lived out. So in this liberationist framework, other voices are brought to the conversation. And so the biblical text then is read and understood from people who are oppressed and people from the margins. So now when we read the biblical text, or as they interpret the biblical text that they're reading the text through the lens of oppressed people. So in this liberationist context, the biblical text is read from the margins. It's read from the perspective of people who have been traditionally oppressed or voices have been silent. And this liberationist framework came through individuals like Gustavo Guterres, who was on the cutting edge of the liberationist theology. So think about the liberationist framework, right, is then understood from the perspective of the oppressed, and therefore now defining what does it mean to be a Christian from that perspective. So for instance, when we read the story of Abraham, his wife Sarah, and her handmaiden Hagar, we're not reading that text from Abraham's perspective. We're not reading it from Sarah's perspective, a wife who could not bear children, but rather we're reading that text and interpreting God's will through the story of Hagar, a woman who had a child, who was then put out of the house, became a single mother, and having to raise her child on her own and having God to come and assist her in that process. So when we think about the liberationist framework, we're saying that there are voices that can speak to the Christian faith and what it means that are different, are typically marginalized, but their voices should be heard and are as valid as a traditional viewpoint. So within this viewpoint, you'll hear about theologies from Black liberation theology. You may even hear queer theology. You may even hear feminist theology. All of these are perspectives that are now being brought into the conversation and are saying that we can give a comprehensive interpretation of the biblical text and thus define what does it mean to be a Christian based on these perspectives. The third framework that I'm going to share with you in this video is called a post-colonial theological perspective. And that's a large phrase, but what it's essentially saying is that in order for us to understand what it means to be a Christian, or how one is identified as such, you have to understand power dynamics, sociology, history, and culture. What we're getting at is how do we understand power dynamics between male and female? It's understood as having more power than the other. A different race having more power, or a different ethnic group having more power over another ethnic group, and thus being able to define how right and wrong is described or understood is based on how that power dynamic is in place to define what right and wrong is and how that is lived out in the culture. To give you even a further understanding of the theological framework of post-colonial interpretation, how Christian missionaries were playing a part in what we know in history as manifest destiny, and how that power, how that perspective was used to push an American agenda.
People think of it as the official policy of territorial expansion, the idea that God had blessed America to become an ocean-bound republic in the 19th century.
And because God had ordained that according to manifest destiny ideology, the allowance, if you will, how you can enslave one group over another because it was God's plan, how land can be taken from Native American individuals who own property, right? How all of these things and all of these are examples of how post-colonial theology or interpretation now goes back and say, well, what about this issue of women's rights? How many minorities were really involved in the building up of the countries or establishing the American concept? Or how many women were in leadership during these times? And these voices should be heard as well. And so when we think about this question again, are you a Christian? Well, it really depends on the context by which you are interpreting scripture that gives you that identification of what it means to represent Christianity, what Christianity looks like in the world, and how we are interpreting the biblical text gives us a comprehensive and ethical explanation of one, what is Christianity, and then two, how it is to be represented and lived out in the world. So what are we to understand? Well, it's very nuanced. Whenever the question is asked, are you a Christian? What people are really asking you, do you believe the way I believe? Do you believe and interpret the Bible the way I interpret the Bible? And what we are gathering from that sort of response, that Christianity is contextual, that how we interpret the text is contextual. What I'm not saying there's more than one gospel. What I am saying and how that gospel is represented is extremely context and nuanced. And the more that we understand these nuances, when we see the news and we see one religious group that considers themselves Christian, even though reading the same Bible, having very different interpretations, now you know why it's happening. And now you can understand how do you, one, speak to these differences? Where do you situate yourself within these contexts, and by which you're able to live out your Christian faith in a way that is authentic to the gospel, but is also representative of what you believe the gospel truly is, and how your interpretation of that gospel can be used to make the world a better place. So watch the next video right here, because we're continuing to bring up these various social issues and how we can understand these issues from what the gospel says. And so thank you so much for watching this video, and we'll see you in the next one. Peace.